Okay, so we're live. It's recording. So let's start talking. So obviously you want to learn about tuning and you want to figure out what the software can do for you and how I can help you. So I like to start these things with me answering some questions for you first. Do you have any specific questions that I can answer?
Yes. So like in the sense of like, most of these guys when they have their G37 coupes and sedans, most of them the first thing that they're doing is they're doing the 3-inch intakes. So
Right.
I've heard a lot of things about different, all sorts of different ones like Z1 Motorsport intakes,
Mm-hmm.
Admin Tuning and Casey Works Designs 3-inch intakes. What else? And then I've also heard of like Takeda. Those I think I would go towards those the most, considering that they have that guard that goes over the front of the filter. Just for the purpose of rain and stuff like that. So
Okay.
lock the motor, which I mean, obviously, I haven't heard of anyone really hydro locking the motor. With the intakes, the filters being up front, because obviously you need to flood the hell out of them. But I mean, which ones? I mean, couldn't they all be the same in the sense of power?
Well, I think that's a good question, because there are a lot of intakes on the market, and you know, figuring out which intake to use on the vehicle can be, as far as the benefits you're going to get, you can get really good power on stock airboxes. Stock airboxes work great. They really do. It's my belief that any of these aftermarket intakes, if you're going to go with an aftermarket unit, you go with the 3-inch. I mean, why bother sticking with the same diameter tubing when you could just upgrade to the largest diameter possible and reduce any intake restriction? Um, the problem that I have with any aftermarket intake is that the accuracy of the mass airflow sensor that gets placed into the tubing. So if you look at a factory intake system, let's take a look at it real quick here. Let's look at, uh, hold on, 370Z stock air intake. Let's look at that. So here it is. There's a picture of it. So you can see on this ad, you see all this, these kind of like these little ridges and little bends and things like that that they have. And there's all these weird little boxes, things like that.
Yeah.
Even the design of this air box, the way that the way the filter sits in here and how the air flows through this mass airflow sensor. Those mass airflow sensors are extremely sensitive. They read mass airflow from 0 to 5 volts, and when you change the style of tubing that the sensor sits in, or you change the diameter of the tubing, even if you leave the diameter alone and you're only changing the design of the actual tube itself, what that does is it changes the dynamics of how the air flows over the sensor. So if you're not familiar with what those sensors look like, how do we double click on this? Okay, so mass airflow sensor. Why isn't it typing? Let's take a look one real quick. So they kind of look like that's the one that's like in your car. It looks like something like that. Let's see if there's a better picture of another one that's similar. Oh, here we go. There's one from a Ford. Well, you see, it's got this sensor element, and it's a really thin wire. And generally, how they're supposed to work is that the ECU sends a signal. It sends a voltage through that sensor, and the resistance changes based on. So as the air flows over the sensor, it cools the wire, and the more power that needs to go through that wire to maintain its temperature, that indicates to the ECU how much air is flowing through it. Okay, that's the principle it works on. Now, what's that?
And is that by that green, where the green little line is?
Yeah, I mean, this is a forward sensor, but there's, they all work on the same principle, and the idea is for the little wire to measure how many air molecules are passing through. And of course, they have an air temperature sensor as well, and that helps with the calculation because if the air is colder, it's denser, and that changes the computations.
Gotcha.
So,
of like what air, and how much air.
how many grams per second of airflow is going into the motor? That's ultimately what we want to know. How much air is the motor consuming, right? So this sensor does an actual measurement, but as you can see, the sensor is in the middle of the pipe, and it's not looking at all of the air that's going through it. It's assuming laminar airflow with a particular type of distribution of that air. So when you change a pipe design and you go back to, you go from something that looks like, like something that looks like this, you go to a smooth tube, that encourages the air to flow differently through the tube. And the way that the mass airflow sensor is going to detect the airflow is, going to change. And in many cases, under, lighter kind of daily driving type conditions where the air isn't necessarily flowing as fast, the accuracy of the measurement of the mass air from the mass airflow sensor can be reduced. So that can impact fuel economy because the sensor will report certain amount of airflow to the ECU, and then the ECU may over or under fuel the engine because it thinks it's a certain amount of air, but there isn't. The other thing that's going to affect is engine load. So engine load, let's open up the tuning guide. So here's a tuning guide. Okay, so let's look at ignition timing. Okay, there's your ignition timing map, right? All right, so, oh wait, that's not it. That's something else. Hold on, find another. There we go. So there's two versions of this in Ecutek. There's the factory mapping, which looks like this. And it only goes up to an engine load of about 101%. And then they have higher resolution map, which when you install Ecutek, you get this version that you could choose to use. And it actually goes up to 140% load, but you can change that. It'll go all the way up to whatever number you want to put in there, right? So on an NA car driven at sea level, you typically end up seeing the engine load somewhere in the, between low hundreds, high 90s to like maybe around 110, 111. Sometimes they go in here, it just kind of depends on how well the car's breathing and the atmospheric conditions.
Gotcha.
And so the engine load, if you go full throttle, is supposed to basically stay in these couple columns right here. So the engine load is computed primarily from the mass airflow signal for how much air is the car consuming. So you can see, for example, a cell like, let's take an example where it's a steep drop off, like over here, for example, right? You have 20 degrees at 52.7% load and 24 degrees at 46.9. Well, if your mass airflow sensor reading becomes more inaccurate, it may no longer be able to tell the difference between these two load cells. So then you're going to have to run 20 degrees here and 20 degrees there. Because if you run 24 degrees when you're supposed to run 20, if you do it over here, then what happens is the engine will knock. And the fuel becomes unstable. And so performance, assuming you have all the safety functions of the ECU in place, it will pull timing. And it'll pull timing as you're accelerating. Let's say you're going full throttle. Let's say you're over here, and instead of 8 degrees, it ran 10 in the cell, right? So what's going to happen is it says, okay, we're going to correct the ignition advance. Maybe it'll pull 4 degrees of timing. And so every cell that it executes after that, it'll take 4 degrees away. So instead of 19 degrees here, you'll run 15, right? Now that ultimately means power loss. And the ECU does recover as you're doing your pull with varying degrees of, how long it takes. it eventually does take that correction and bring it back up to 0, so it doesn't pull any more timing. But these kinds of situations really, especially in a custom tune where you have very specific values for these things, if there's a mistake somewhere, it does affect performance significantly. So there's a couple things you could do. First of all, you want to have these values as accurate as possible for load. So you want to make sure you're measuring your airflow as accurately as possible in order for this timing map to work. And you don't want to do the timing first and then go back and say, oh, we're going to change the airflow, because now you're throwing your whole timing map off. So you don't want to do that.
So you want to, like, in the sense of, if you like want to get intakes, obviously you want to add that first before you go and
exactly
mess with any of them.
Exactly. And even if your intakes are the same diameter as stock intakes, they're still not going to read that airflow quite the same way that they would if they were stock.
It's factory.
And as you can see, the timing map runs a lot of advance at lighter loads where you're cruising, you're on the freeway and stuff like that. And there can really be a pretty big difference. I mean, this is kind of like a unmodified map, right? This is pretty much stock map here that they give you with the tune. Or maybe this one might have been customized slightly, but the idea is, like, look over here, 1600 RPM and 2000. Look at the difference. It's like, what is that? It's 9 degrees difference. So there's a lot of interpolation. There's a lot of blanks being filled in there. I'm sorry?
You're looking between the 1600 RPMs and 2000, you said?
Yeah, you see how much of a difference there is in the advance? There's 15 degrees here, and then there's all of a sudden 26 here.
Yeah, I see it.
Right? So situations like that can happen horizontally all the time. And here they don't here, but they usually do. And because when your load goes up, you've got more pressure. When you got more pressure, especially at lower engine speeds, you've got a higher likelihood of the fuel to become unstable, and then you get detonation. That's why you see this pattern here. You have a lot of negative values, then they sort of start climbing, and they sort of maintain themselves around here, right? This is kind of a weird timing map. It's just what they have in their example. It's not usually what they look like, but you get the idea, right? There's a very specific amount of advance that you want to run in every single load cell, and there's 480 load cells. So when you tune a car on a dyno, you're going full throttle, the mass airflow sensor, it's picking up whatever it's picking up, and it's staying somewhere. Let's assume it's staying, it's measuring full load. So whether that's 87 or it's 117 or whatever it is, you're basically sticking around between two columns. Well, who's going to take the time to go back and tune the rest of this thing? How do you get to these columns here? What about what happens in these columns? How much time is being spent to tune that? Right? So, and then the other thing too is when the fuel becomes unstable, I think I mentioned this earlier, you get detonation. Did I explain to you what that was?
No.
Okay, so detonation, what that is it's an irregular combustion of fuel. So let's do a quick detour here. What is detonation? Detonation? No, that's not what it. That's something else. Hold on. Oh, here we go. That's looks like a video on YouTube. So there's a lot of videos. You can watch them. This one is who did that one? No. I know there's a couple of good ones that I've seen. HP Tuners has one. Knock and Detonation Explained. I like this one. That's a good video, I think. I think Denso did this one. Anyways, the point is the fuel becomes unstable. And when the pressure rises and you've got heat and you're trying to make the most power, your fuel can become unstable and it can sort of start to burn on its own. And so you've got multiple flame fronts, and instead of having a smooth gradual rise in pressure in the combustion chamber, you end up with a spike in pressure. And then of course, that spike in pressure, if it's allowed to continue for a long enough period of time, you end up with, I was hoping to see the picture, like, yeah, you end up with stuff like this, right? So that's going to damage the engine. So reducing the cylinder pressure can be done in a number of ways, but the main way that it's done is by retarding the timing. So the way that works is ignition timing on its own. I don't know how much you know about it, but it's a lot like riding a bicycle. The faster you go, at any given point, there's an optimal time for you to push down on the pedals of the crank, right? In effect, there's an optimal time for you to deliver peak pressure onto the top of the piston as the engine is spinning. So if the engine is spinning really fast, and the fuel, the rate at which the fuel burns is affected by a few things, but let's assume we're only looking at engine speed. So if you assume the fuel will burn at the same rate all the time, then the faster the engine spins, the earlier you need to start your combustion. So if you look at this timing map, let's go back to the timing map. Here the RPM is pretty high, and you can see compared to low RPM, which is here, you have a lot of advance. How many degrees before top dead center? So, you have 12 o'clock is top dead center. That's when the piston's at its highest point. 15 degrees before top dead center, that is 15 degrees before the piston is, as the crank is rotating, right? It's 15 degrees before it reaches that 12 o'clock point where the piston's at top dead center. So the reason you want to start burning the fuel earlier is so that by the time the piston's coming on its way down, that smooth gradual rise of pressure will be optimized to push down on the piston at exactly the right moment, right?
Okay.
So that's the concept of ignition timing. So at lower engine speeds, you don't need to start the burn early. In fact, you want to start it late because you want to wait for the piston to move away. It's rotating so slowly, the engine is, that you have to start your burn later so that your peak pressure is delivered at the optimal time. That's why these values tend to be more negative. Now, this was under the assumption that the fuel burns at the same rate. And we know that it doesn't, right? Because what happens is when you have a higher engine load like 140, you can see there's less advance needed. The reason for that is because the air fuel mixture becomes more concentrated, right? That you're packing more air, more fuel together into the combustion chamber, and so the air molecules and the fuel molecules are tightly coupled, and so the chemical process of burning happens quicker because they find each other faster, right? They're closer together. There's less there's less vacuum in there. What's that?
There's less space for them to move around.
Yeah, it's packed together tighter, so it burns faster. Whereas like something like over here, there's very little load, so there's a very small amount of air and very small amount of fuel, so there's kind of just floating around in there. So it needs more time to complete the burn. So you have to start burning the fuel a lot earlier. That's why it's advanced 50 degrees, as opposed to over here, it's advanced 16.
Okay.
Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So, those types of the burn rate is affected both by the density of the mixture, right? Like anything below 100%, you're usually in vacuum. 100% and higher than that, you're either starting the car is under boost or it's just going full throttle. And sometimes you get scavenging, like artificial force induction. So that's why it's not uncommon to see values are slightly above 100% because let's say your exhaust is open, right? And as the exhaust is open, the exhaust valve is open, the intake valve opens, and the exhaust, the burned fuel and everything else that needs to be expelled goes out the exhaust. And while it does that, it creates it creates vacuum, right? Because it's leaving a space behind as it travels out. And so what that does is it will encourage the air in front of the intake valve to move into the combustion chamber, right? And that gets into cam timing and all that other stuff. But the concept is that you can achieve values over 100% efficiency if you have proper scavenging. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Of course, if your mass airflow sensor is calibrated incorrectly, you could start to see values here even though you don't have any, artificial force induction or scavenging or anything like that. Or you could likewise end up over here. It's very easy to do that because you can start changing fuel settings, you can change, everything works together as a symphony. So anyways, back to sort of where we started this was with the mass airflow sensor being in the tube. The tube design does affect the accuracy of the readings, and that can affect not necessarily your peak power at full load, but it'll affect everything else. And that's why I prefer stock intakes. Or if you're not going to do those, then you might as well go all out and use a 3-inch unit. Because one thing about the 3-inch units that I like, or can't say I like it, it's just it's a benefit that they have in general. Most 3-inch units don't support PCV. You know what PCV is?
Okay. Yeah, I've heard of PCV. That's where the oil's going into the intakes.
Well, that's not the whole the point. The point isn't for the oil to go in. The point is for combustion byproducts. So as your engine's running, there's pressure inside the combustion chamber. Some of that pressure leaks past the rings and gets into the crankcase. So that pressure has to be relieved. But that pressure on its own is actually made up of combustion gases, water, there's unburned fuel, there's all sorts of stuff, right? That gets into your oil behind the piston. Then that gets into your oil pan area and all that. It gets into your valve covers. So the PCV system, what it's supposed to do is it's supposed to collect those vapors, and under the right circumstances, it's supposed to feed those vapors back into the engine for them to be completely burned and combusted. So whether there's fuel or exhaust or anything else like that, that goes through the catalytic converter, and your car produces clean emissions, and it doesn't pollute. Now the problem with this system, as you can imagine, is that if you're ingesting crankcase blow-by into the combustion chamber, that leaves less room for air. So simply by deleting the PCV system, you're going to, oh, hold on, the recording stopped. Was that you or me? There was something that popped up on the...
It came up with a steam log, and that was my...
Oh, okay, I thought my recording stopped or something. Anyways, we're good. So, yeah, what ends up happening is if you delete the PCV system, you can ingest that much more air. That on its own, assuming everything else equal, will allow you to run, will allow you to produce more power, assuming the engine doesn't knock. If the engine knocks, you're going to have to reduce the cylinder pressure, which then becomes counteractive because you're reducing cylinder pressure, you're going to reduce power, which brings up another interesting point. If you have an engine that's knock limited, which means as load goes up, it has to run less timing, right? Now, it's going to run less timing for a fact because there's more load. More load means you run less timing because the mixture is denser. You don't need to start the burn as early, right?
Correct.
But it could be the case that not only do you need to retard the timing for the pressure because of natural balance of where things are, but the fuel may not be stable enough to operate at that pressure because the pressure went up. So not only are you now going to retard the timing for the pressure, but you're going to retard the timing now because the fuel can't sustain that pressure. So you could have a situation where the engine runs more efficiently at 87% load than it does at 111. So even though it's consuming more air at the higher load, the engine's not running as efficiently because there's less advance. Now, it should always be a little bit less advance in general, but not that much less, right? So the fuel is limiting it. So that's an interesting phenomenon. Sometimes when you tune a knock-limited car, if you prevent it from achieving full load, you can actually get it to accelerate a little better. People don't think about that, right? But that's what it is. So I feel like I've been talking for a while. Do you have any questions, or you want to keep going, or?
It's a lot of information to take in, considering that I've never learned anything like this before.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's definitely something I want to keep on learning about.
Yeah.
But it's a lot of information to take in for sure. But as for it in a sense, it does make sense. And I like that you're giving me the visuals for sure, because that way I can understand it a little bit more, because I'm a visual learner.
Right.
But yeah, it is because obviously you probably talk about this all the time.
Man, I'm so tired of talking about this. It's like every time I got to spend hours on the phone every time just to explain. Because here's the thing: people always ask me. They say, "Hey, Gene, I want to get my car tuned. How much power can you produce, right?" And I'm going up against these other guys, right? Like, let me explain something to you. Knock sensitivity, right? So all those things I told you about, detonation and, fuel becoming unstable, it all has to do with knock. We're trying to avoid it in general. Now, the engine can tolerate some amount of knock. It's made...
Everything that you want to avoid is that, obviously, avoiding knock. And, because I know that's obviously something that's very, very bad for the motor.
Well, like I said,
I know
the engine can tolerate some amount of detonation. It's designed to tolerate some amount of it. In fact, from the
correct.
factory, there are certain parts of the. Let's bring the knock sensitivity table up here for a second. Here, hang on. And I'm trying to scroll down, and it's not letting me do it. Here we go. Let's see.
But then, like you were saying earlier, like obviously, yeah, it can handle a certain amount of knock, like you were saying, but under extreme conditions where it keeps on, I guess, feeling the knock sensitivity or feeling that where it's not working together right. That's when obviously things happen where rods go out the side and stuff like that.
I'm trying to find a picture of it for you here, but I don't see it. Um, what is important to recognize is that here's kind of an example. So the green line, where is it on here? What is that? The green line, it looks like cylinder number 4, right? And they got a lot of stuff on it. Oh, are you scrolling or am I scrolling?
Oh, I scrolled. I just want to see the green line. I didn't see the green line.
Well, I'm looking at this line right here.
Oh, the yellow one? Okay.
Yeah, that's a yellow line, so that's a threshold, right? So I think that's cylinder 4. And then the purple line, that's a threshold for cylinder 5. Now the reason they have different thresholds is because the knock sensor is located. There's 2 knock sensors, and depending on what the engine control system is doing, it knows which spark plugs are firing, it knows the positions of all the pistons. It calculates which cylinder is making whatever amount of noise. Okay. Now over here you can see there's a few data points that ended up above the thresholds. So what happens is when the threshold is exceeded, maybe for this cylinder or that cylinder, when those thresholds are exceeded, the engine computer is supposed to retard the advance. So instead of 15 degrees, you're maybe going to run 12, right?
Gotcha.
And the engine is designed to tolerate some amount of these. Let's assume some of these are actual detonation events. It's going to tolerate some of them, and it'll be fine. Nothing's going to happen to it. The problem you run into is when people, they go back to their tune and they say, the tuner comes in and says, okay, I know that these cars, they like to run a certain amount of advance, because you're not going to change that. It's the physics of the engine. It's a particular fuel. It wants a particular amount of advance on that fuel. This is what the tuner wants the car to do. He's going to guarantee a certain amount of power increase, right? Because people always say, how much power am I going to, get? So they go in and that's what they do. The problem is every engine's a little different. Some engines have, carbon deposits. Some engines have whatever, something else. They're manufactured a little differently. They're noisy. They're whatever. So one of the hardest things to do is to determine when the ECU is pulling timing. Is it pulling it for detonation, or is it pulling it because it's just noisy? Is it pulling it because, uh, you know, who knows? I mean, it could be doing it for any number of reasons. So Ecutek's recommendation is no more raising these thresholds no more than 5 to 10%. And here they kind of give you an explanation. So you see it says raising these maps by 5 or maybe 10% will make it less sensitive to knock, but you must always check for detonation with a third-party device. And what that means is that if your tuner decides to desensitize your car to make it run more advanced, they highly recommend that tuner, you got to click continue to continue sharing the screen.
Gotcha.
Yeah. They recommend that your tuner uses a knock listening device to verify that the engine is in fact not knocking. And the thing with knock is the human ear sometimes can't hear it. And if you allow it to continue, being unchecked for a long time, it will destroy the engine. Okay. So some cars can make a lot of power and they're great. Other cars don't. And you take 2 of the same cars, maybe 1 or 2 cylinders are knocking, the other 4 are still making power. That car will continue to put out better numbers on the dyno, but it's at the expense of those 1 or 2 cylinders.
Correct.
So that's a problem with the tuning, is that as far as, well, obviously we talked about, here you go, here's some knock control, turning the knock sensors off here and turning them on here. So from the factory they'll kind of look like this, and when you tune it, I usually turn them all on. I turn everything on.
So that it's all green, or
yeah, so that everything's red and it picks up knock everywhere.
Okay. When it says like a third-party device, what would a third party device be for
Like a
like knock,
Plex,
like
like
you
a
were saying?
Plex knock monitor, or like there's another product that's a little more affordable. There's a couple of different ones out there. So this guy, he talks about it. You can watch that video. Plex, this is the one I have. I use
Hold
this.
on, it's not refreshing. It looks like it's
Oh,
still
I
at
must
the
be clicking on something else. Hold on.
Okay.
Yeah, here we go. Just a sec. There we go. Okay. Plex knock monitor. Yeah, so I have this one, but this one's very expensive. I mean, there's other products like it that are cheaper. So that's what it looks like. And you can read about this later. But what basically you bolt it onto the engine, and then it's supposed to pick up knock on its own without the ECU. And sometimes having something like this to look at the patterns that the engine's producing, that can be really useful. If the ECU is going crazy, but this thing isn't saying anything, oftentimes that's an indication that, you need to make an adjustment. And the problem with stuff like that is that the more you adjust it, the more likely you are to miss real knock and real detonation. So all the tuning that you do, if you start messing with these knock sensors, unless you're running a really high quality fuel, there's risks involved. So all these cars that are making the maximum power, most of them have the knock sensors very, very desensitized, much more than 10%, or they're just disabled. And I do it too sometimes. If I'm tuning a really high horsepower car and I know it's running good fuel and I have this thing plugged to the motor and the customer wants numbers, I don't mind. I mean, I'll tune the shit out of it, but
Yeah.
but again, there's a lot of you got to be smart about it. You don't want to start desensitizing these things on pump gas.
Okay.
Maybe a little bit sometimes, but I really try to avoid it. And you can make really good power with stock settings. Some engines can take it and some can't. It's no
You're
excuse.
saying
It's
about
no excuse to
like
desensitize them.
gas, high or good quality gas. Can you elaborate what you mean on like what kind of gas I guess
Octane rating.
is the best? I mean, I go to Shell and I fill up at the
It's
same
not,
gas
the issue
station,
isn't the brand.
only one place.
It's not
I
that the
only go to
brand isn't
Shell
the
and I can get
problem.
93 V power.
Can you hear what I'm saying?
That like, yeah, I can hear
I'm saying that the
what you're
brand
saying.
isn't the issue. The brand of the fuel is irrelevant. It's the octane rating.
Okay.
So the octane rating will dictate how stable the fuel is. So if you run E85, hang on a sec here. E85 octane rate, what is it? 108 octane.
Gotcha.
Right? Versus if you ran 93, that's 93 octane. So that's a much different, it's much more stable. You can add a lot more cylinder pressure, much more advanced, and the engine will be happy. And you can actually make more power and have the engine be more reliable and safer because it's not being exposed to detonation. So even though it's putting out more power, it's actually running more safely.
With the E85.
Well, yeah, it's a higher octane fuel. Now, ideally,
Gotcha.
you'd run race gas because race gas, the amount of energy contained in E85 is less than in, say, race gas, right? They can both be used to produce similar power, but the thing is with E85, you have to spray more of that fuel into the combustion chamber. And when you're spraying more of the fuel in, it's about 30 to 40% more, depending on, exactly what you're doing. But the more of it you spray, the less room you have to put air in there. So you make up for that with efficiency because you can have more timing. But at the same time, you're reducing the amount of air. So if you, instead of running E85, especially in like a boosted car, if you ran like a really high quality race gas, you get even better power out of it because you can stuff that much more air in there. Yeah, we could talk about this all day. So as far as
I was just wondering what you were saying. I knew you were gonna say something along the lines of something like that, but I just wanted to get like a good answer out of you, and that was definitely a good answer.
Yeah, the main thing when you're tuning the car is evaluating the car over a long period of time over all these different load cells. And the only way that I've found that you can realistically do that, and basically leaving the car's knock detection system alone. In fact, I will make it more sensitive. I turn it on when it's off. I raise the sensitivity. I say, okay, I want you to listen a little closer under certain conditions, because in my experience, I've listened to these cars with my tool and I've found places where the stock system will actually miss knock. And like I said, the engine can tolerate it under the right conditions. It'll be okay. But I don't like to hear that. I don't like to expose the mechanical part of the car to that. That's not, that's what a custom tune's all about, is going in and finding those areas, those problem areas, and cleaning them up and getting it right specifically for that engine. And so you can do that. You can get more efficiency out of it. Um, but doing all that, collecting all that data, uh, that takes, you can't just do like a couple data logs and say it's done. Like I'll collect hundreds of megabytes of data,
Gotcha.
and
That's where
so,
a
and I
lot
keep
of
working
tuners,
on this map.
see, like in a sense, like how you just said that, you can obviously tell that you take the time where it's needed, to make not just the customer happy, but make the car happy. Where a lot of these guys, they'll say, "Yeah, I'll tune your car. Just send me a few logs," and then next thing you know, they give them a tune where they're making more horsepower. But guess what? The customer itself is not going to know. Well, the average customer would say, they're going to be like, "Oh, my car's got more power," but they don't even realize that, okay, well, you just messed with your car and your car's not happy. But how is he going to know that unless it's,
The whole thing's very complicated. It's very complicated.
Like that, along those lines.
And it's important. I feel it's important when you're working with someone and they're tuning the car. It's a good idea to know, uh, what's the person changing? What are they changing in the tune? How are they making the car do that? Like they're having it run more timing. Well, does the car want to run more timing? Are they forcing it? How does it compare to stock? Some of the tunes will come out, they run less timing than stock. And sometimes you have to understand that. Maybe sometimes it's normal for it to do that, because otherwise the ECU would pull timing. And then the tuner goes in and customizes it. You have to have these conversations,
And that's a lot of people, they don't even care. They say, "Give me more power and you figure out the rest." You know what I mean?
Yeah, and some people don't care, but I like to educate, and I feel like this is
And that's exactly where I'm different. I want to learn these things because guess what? I want to know when you're telling me these things will do this, do that, or change. I don't you know what I mean? Just under certain circumstances, I want to know exactly what you're talking about, so that way I know what you're talking about when I'm 2,000 miles away from you with my car. You know what I mean?
Yep.
So.
Yeah, so there's a lot more to learn and there's a lot more to do. But yeah, as far as answering any additional questions, was there anything else you wanted to know?
What was I going to say? Trying to think of anything off the top of my head. Oh yeah, so like you were saying with the PCV valve.
Yeah.
I know so like I've seen like how I was saying about like the certain oils and stuff. Like I know so like when they got like these aftermarket intakes, they have a little pipe coming off the side or a little extender coming off the side of their intakes where it feeds into like a filter with like a catch can and stuff like that. And you were saying that's the stuff that you would advise against?
Yeah, if your car is running a mass airflow sensor, which in your case, it is, you do not want to vent any of that air to the atmosphere, because what happens is the mass airflow sensor will pick up that airflow, it'll report that airflow to the ECU, and the ECU will convert it to an engine load. Then the ECU will run a specific amount of timing for that load, and it will produce a certain amount of fueling for that load. And guess what happens? If that air escapes before it has a chance to go into the motor, well, then that's wrong. It's not ingesting that amount of air. It's gonna overfuel it. It's gonna run the wrong amount of advance. It's gonna overfuel it. It's gonna run the wrong amount of timing. Then the ECU is gonna start to learn stuff. It's gonna think it's running rich, and it's gonna take fuel away when you go wide open throttle, which is gonna make it run lean. So you don't want to do that.
Now, why do people run that kind of setup then, where they run the PCV valves with the oil catch can?
So usually the way that's done is that the air which is coming off the intake is not allowed to leave. So they will cap off the intake. And then what they do is they put filters or breathers on the valve covers. So because the valve cover, once it's disconnected, the intake manifold and the valve covers, once they're no longer attached to the air boxes, then you can vent them. And you can do that. but you are going to generally run slightly higher crankcase pressures than you would if you had vacuum.
Okay.
Right? That's what the PCV system is primarily for. It's for that, and it's for emissions. It's to suck out all that steam that's being built up by the motor and to get it out of there, right? Because the longer that those fumes and vapors hang around inside the crankcase, the more opportunity they have to do any kind of damage. You know, the oil becomes more oxidized. You can get staining issues, sludge buildup. Now, a lot of people won't have those issues, but it can happen. If you live in a cold climate and maybe the engine doesn't warm up all the way, you get a lot of moisture buildup and it doesn't get sucked out of there. And you get like, it's kind of like taking a hot shower on a cold day.
Yeah.
You know, so that's, I don't like those things. You know, I'm just not I just don't care for it. I mean, if the customer wants to run it, I mean, that's fine if it's allowed in there wherever they live. But, you know, for me,
Say,
I'm
for an
just not a
example,
fan.
I live in Chicago. You know, is that I know actually a few people that run that system on their G37 coupes and sedans. Is that something like, is that like the weather that you're talking about, like Chicago weather? Like right now, it's cold as hell out and it's raining.
I mean, it could be.
No.
It could be. I'm going to tell you, I don't have any direct experience because here in California, everybody runs PCV. And the people that don't,
Okay.
um, you know, I have seen a lot of sludged up engines even with PCV. Uh, I can't really give you direct advice on that particular
Yeah.
topic, but I'm just telling you how the
Wonder.
system's supposed to work and what it's supposed to do. And it's not perfect. Sometimes oil does get ingested, and that's what a good catch can is for. Um, so you
Gotcha.
can run the system and put a catch can on a boosted application. It does help a lot. Um,
Yeah.
but on NA, the main benefit that people would see as far as increasing in power would be by simply, you know, not allowing the intake manifold to suck, uh, you know, not allowing any of those vapors to go into
Right.
the intake manifold.
Okay. So you're saying, I just want to clarify. So you're saying with the oil catch can and those breathers would be good on a boosted application, but as for NA,
No,
you
no,
would
no.
want more of a vacuum seal.
You're mixing up two different things.
Oh. Okay.
On an application where you're using a mass airflow sensor, you do not
Gotcha.
vent the air because the mass airflow sensor is measuring that air. If it's accounting for it, if that air comes in and then it leaves, your car's not going to run right.
Okay.
I don't care what your setup is. If you measure the air and then you let it leave, you're doing it wrong.
Gotcha. Okay.
So if your system is closed, right, like you're not venting it because you have a MAF, it doesn't matter how many catch cans you put in. You go ahead and go crazy with it, but you can't vent it.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Does that make sense? There's absolutely no point. You're creating a vacuum leak if you vent it into the intake. The engine's going to start
Yeah.
sucking in unmetered air.
Okay.
It doesn't make sense. You need to put a second MAF or something. I mean, there's ways of working around it. I mean, on boosted cars, you usually don't run MAFs. You boosted cars usually are supposed to run speed density, which estimates the airflow rather
Okay.
than measuring it, and it does so
Oh
using
yeah.
the
See,
intake
I didn't
manifold
know that.
pressure. Yeah. So you don't vent
It's not like.
with MAFs. You don't do that. I mean, you
Okay.
can vent if you plug the intake manifold, but again, the key to answering that question is looking at the airflow into the engine and answering the question, is any of that air leaving and is anything else getting sucked in? And the answer should be no. So as long as you do that, I don't care what you do, how many catch cans or breathers you put on, it doesn't matter.
Oh yeah. No, I'm not. I'm not even in the market or even looking at something like that. I was curious to know um, the science behind it and
Mm-hmm.
why people run it, because I never understood why
Right.
people had that. Especially when they open up their engine bays and you see all this extra stuff.
Mm-hmm.
You're thinking, well, what the hell are they running that for? What's it doing? And why they spend tons of money on something if they don't need it, or if they do need it.
My recommendation is
For
if you want any like really crazy power gains is to go boosted. And if you don't, if you simply keep the stock intakes and maybe throw a set of test pipes or something on, you do something like that, your vehicle, like the performance you're going to get just from doing that and getting a really good solid tune on it, and especially if you have a good fuel, like if you run E85 or something like that, that will give you like that'll get you like 90% there. No cams,
Okay.
no whatever, you know, because I mean the amount of money you're gonna have to spend to really get like that last 10, 15, whatever horsepower is just so much money, you know?
And
It's just
that's
not
what I
worth
don't
it.
understand because, I mean, like I was telling you earlier, my number one goal with my 2013 G37 IPL coupe is I want to go boosted. I want to get either a single turbo or a double turbo or a twin turbo setup.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't done a lot of research, but I mean I've seen a few kits that I would like to do, like the Soho kit, which is a single turbo setup, or I can go with the AAM twin turbo setup. I heard that you were telling me
There's actually a much better kit than that's out there. Let me show you.
But
this one right here.
I mean, I've thought of all sorts of different things, like I was even thinking about even getting a Q60 coupe, and because that's obviously a turbo setup already, and I want to switch up the transmission and go 6-speed manual, with a G37 or a 370Z the JK 6-speed manual setup, and convert that to manual. I've thought of all sorts of different things, or taking my G37 and pulling the Q60 motor, buying a salvage Q60 or even a GTR.
I don't see it for me. I don't like really any of that stuff because
there's all sorts of different
Can you hear me?
that you can do. But
hello?
Yeah.
What I was trying to say was I'm not really a big fan of like doing huge Frankenstein projects like that. I like stuff to be clean, factory fit without any complications. And you start getting into all sorts of ECU issues and programming, vehicle compatibility issues. So I really like this particular kit here. I don't know if you can see on your screen.
No, I'm looking. Yeah, no, and that's exactly how I feel. Is what you just said. Is those are just kind of brainstorming, but that's my number one goal is obviously when I'm trying to do this stuff to my cars, I want reliability, and I want I guess in the sense of safety, I want it to be all compatible and as OEM as I can keep it, because obviously when you go with an OEM setup, guess what? They specifically kept it like that or designed it like that to be the most reliable, safest car that you can have, for your motor and for the car itself. And that's, I mean, overall what I'm trying to shoot for. But, at the end of the day, too, I want to, make some power and have, a nice, fast car,
So I would definitely look into this kit here, which you probably haven't noticed before. This uses all OEM GTR parts, and these things make great power on pump gas and E85. And he's got a video on YouTube. I'll get you the video. Hang on a second. You can watch this right after we hang up. We're almost done here. Where's this thing?
Yeah, no problem. Okay, so this is on the VQ37V high rev motor.
This is the engine that you have in your G37.
Correct, and they're doing the header, exhaust header mount.
Everything
turbos,
everything is OEM GTR.
That's why, that's what I was gonna say too. I was thinking about running a setup where you get I know they make like adapters.
He makes those adapters. That's what he does.
Mount exactly. Okay.
So here's a video. Oh, it's not letting me. How do you do that? Hang on, so I'm gonna type it in for you. Wait, that's not the right window. Hold on. Here we go.
Yeah, I actually watched. There's the guy with the 370Z that actually tried doing this, and I was keeping up with his forum that he had on I think it was my G37 or my370Z.com, and he had a whole install video with months of work that he was doing.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought it was fascinating reading, what he was encountering, what he was doing.
Right.
But this is definitely awesome. Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. That I also thought of doing that, where they had those header adapters, where you can run the header exhaust mount header turbo system from
Well, let's wrap up the call. I'm gonna leave you with that video. You can contact that guy if you want to talk to him. Are there any other questions? I forget. Did you need to pick up like any programming kits, or was there anything that we need to do to wrap up the conversation, or you want to get in touch with me later?
Um, I have one more question for you. Maybe
Okay.
you can answer. I'm kind of confused on what's going on with my car at the moment. Like, so I don't know if
Let me
you know,
stop
I have
let
another
me stop the recording.
G37 coupe. I
Can
have
you
an
hear
old
me?
coupe,
Hello?
and
Hey, you there?
yeah.
Let me stop the recording. We don't probably don't need to record that, so I'm gonna
No.
shut it down here.